Thank you, Alexis. Actually, it raised wonderful conversations that the next 3 days we're going to be discussing. So that's fantastic. Our third speaker in this session is Nicole Aylwin. She is a PhD candidate in communication and culture at York University, as well as the academic coordinator for the York Center for Public Policy and Law. Her research interests include cultural rights, cultural policy, cultural heritage, and intellectual property. She's going to be giving us a paper today titled Straddling the Past and the Future, Traditional Art, Contemporary Artists, and Pan-African Cultural Policy.
All right, thank you. Again, two wonderful presentations to start us off, and as the other two presenters said, thank you very much, Victor, for giving us such a wonderful welcome, and to Solon for organizing the event, and to George and the rest of the iPinch team for inviting me to speak today. This is actually has been a great opportunity for me to think about some of the research I've been doing in South Africa with various arts organizations and civil society groups, and to think about some of the data that I've gathered over the past couple of years in a very different light. So I don't know if I can quite follow oop-pick and used women's underwear, because I'm going to be talking about policy, which is not near as exciting, but I will try my best. So what I want to talk to you guys about today is actually the role that Pan-African cultural policies play in the commodification of culture in Africa as a continent. And I make that distinction because Africans, rightly so, are very prickly about people referring to Africa as if it is a country and not a number of countries. So since 1990, Africa, again as a continent, has devoted a really considerable amount of energy to developing a number of Pan-African cultural policy instruments that are actually designed to revitalize and rethink and basically utilize African culture as a means of development, right? And when I say development, I mean to develop economic goals, but also a number of social goals as well. And so, given I have such limited time, I kind of want to jump right in and suggest that what these energies have amounted to in Africa is a set a set of parallel discourses and policy initiatives that have emerged. And you can see them up here. On the one hand, we get a great deal of talk about heritage. And on the other, we get a lot of talk about creative economies. And I'm sure for most of you in this room, both of these terms are quite familiar. So I want to start just with heritage. And the emphasis that has been placed on heritage in these policies and in their implementation has largely been on natural heritage. So a real promotion of things like ecotourism, animals, natural habitats, cultural tourism, things like this. And there has been a real sense of trying to bring the past into the future. So capitalizing on that idea of the past as something that, can revitalize futures. So it's positioned very much in the documents as a tool. So as a tool to alleviate poverty, right, in Indigenous communities. And I should also say that I use the term Indigenous when speaking about Africa very hesitantly because the identity politics around the term Indigenous are very, very different there, but for shorthand today, I'll use it. So alleviating poverty and bring development to Indigenous communities, revitalizing urban economic spheres as well, reinvigorating civil society, so this idea that bringing about social cohesion and creating national identities. And then finally, and I've done quite a bit of work in South Africa, and in South Africa, the discourse and policy initiatives around heritage also have a therapeutic function. So the idea is by looking to the past and capitalizing on the past and heritage, it can actually heal some of those post-apartheid wounds that still run very, very deep. So when you look very closely, though, and many scholars have done so quite recently, is what this heritage policy has the effect of doing is actually organizing African heritage around a very, very specific version of Africa. And this is one, unfortunately, that is very traditional and tribal and exotic and old world and ancient. So you get things, of course, like this standing in for the cultural heritage of Africa, right? Zulu reed dancing. Or this is a picture of a San Cultural Center where actually this comes from the South African tourism website, and there's a little caption there that tells us how a modern man can learn the ways of the past by visiting and actually going on a traditional hunting trip. And of course, George mentioned these in his introduction, right? Rock art, which also is a kind of way to symbolize the ancientness of African culture. So something that I want to note about scaling up to the policy level is that these policies are very much about bringing tourist dollars into the country, right? So they're locally rooted, but they're about bringing other people's monies here, right, and showcasing what Africa has in the continent. Now, if I can just turn your attention over to this side, which is the creative economies model, this is a much more modern policy framework, right? So just so we're all on the same page, the creative economies concept is something that, you know, actually Margaret Thatcher, who's just passed away, is responsible for kind of developing and circulating, basically. And it's the idea that in our information economy, what drives these new global economies is creativity and innovation and cultural difference, right? It's not those older things like manufacturing, right? Actual goods or services. It's ideas and difference and those unique things about places. So, you know, and just to give you an example of what is encapsulated in these industries, it can be anything from architecture to cultural tourism, fashion design, food. Some people consider this to be a creative, innovative industry. And of course, all of these things where intellectual properties are derived and can generate income. So, you know, very much like the heritage policies, these policies also focus on using culture as a tool, right, to stimulate economies, right? They commodify cultural difference, right, for the purposes of creating and generating income. But unlike the heritage policies, right, they are more globally focused. So what they're actually aimed to do, or in Africa, what they've actually aimed to do, is use this policy and discourse not to bring people or money here, but to open up, and what I'm going to be talking about in just a minute, opening up arts markets to the African artists and African heritage. So they're external, or I think of them as external policies, in that they want to open up something larger. And this was brought to my attention when I was interviewing the head of this large civil society organization called the Arterial Network. And I spoke a lot to the director of the organization at the time. And what's really interesting about these discourses, at least in the civil society sphere, is that they are viewed as a means for promoting cultural recognition globally. So the idea that an artist or could want to commodify their product and then sell it on a global market is actually a way of thinking about cultural diversity, right? It's how people around the world get exposed to African culture. And so this was not something that to be thought negatively of, but actually something that promoted diversity, which I think is a fairly reasonable position when you think about how much of our cross-cultural exchange is done in the commodity markets. So what happens? Well, oh, sorry, I have another little graphic for you here. Just to give you a sense, the idea of creative economies has been really, really, really popular, both with governments, right, because it's an interesting way for them to remain hands-off, right, and encourage communities themselves to be creative and innovative, right, and to sell themselves. But it's been really popular with artists and civil society groups as well. And every year, they're on their third year this year, and it's been growing. They hold a African Creative Economies Conference, which has been picking up steam. But what I think happens, or some of the interesting things I wanted to open up for discussion today and what we'll talk about over the next couple of days, is a kind of tension that gets created between this discourse of heritage, which very much focuses on fetishizing the past, right? And a creative economies discourse, which very much focuses on the global and the future and the modern idea of cultural heritage. And it causes, I think, a couple of interesting tensions and a few problems. So those first two pictures there are from the Ghana tourism website. And again, very much what scholars have called tribal fetishization, right, of African culture. And one of the first problems is that within these two competing policy discourses, depending on which one wins out, depending on the specific kind of implementation, it can be very difficult for what we might consider contemporary artists, right, who aren't producing art that looks traditional, to actually find institutional support for their work. And the third picture I have there is, I think, a really interesting case. It's a wire sculpture from the village of Bella Bella in South Africa, and this is again a picture on the South African tourism website. And this is very much contemporary art, and what these artists do is they scavenge around their surroundings and they find this wire and they make it into contemporary art sculptures. But interestingly, when you read what happens on the website, is that when these artists are promoted, they're actually, you know, this art sculpture is actually promoted as part of a larger ecotourism cell, where everything in this village is, reused, and, they're so traditional, and there's no environmental harm. And so rather than seeing this artwork as contemporary art, right, non-traditional art, it's actually just one more way to market kind of natural heritage. So that's a problem. Second is that often what happens then on the other side of this, if you look from the creative economy's perspective, it can relegate these more traditional forms of artistic expression to the informal economy. So it means that arts and crafts, let's say, of the Zulu people aren't kind of given the same weight in terms of thinking about the global arts market, right? Oh, well, that's just heritage, right? That's just like nice arts and crafts that people make for tourists and to put it in the gift shops, right? It's not really art. It's not really at the same kind of value, right, as what we consider to be a creative economy. And part of that, I should say, is as a result of the fact that the creative economies discourse globally focuses very much around information technology and kind of art that utilizes kind of information and technology, so around the audio-video sector in particular. So these are two, I think, significant problems that arise when we look at these parallel discourses. And because I haven't got the wave yet, which means I have more time than I expected, or maybe she's just busy making notes. I wanted to point out a couple of things that I eliminated from my presentation for fear of going over, which is some really interesting, there's lots of really interesting things around this, and I've only started looking at them, so I'll raise a couple of other flags for you. But civil society groups are really interesting in terms of how they are acting as mediators and to implement these policies. Because on the one hand, they've actually been, I guess, some of the key promoters of the commodification of arts and culture. So the Arterial Network actually had applied for and been given some money to do these capacity building projects, where they basically went into villages and communities to help them implement. It's a very long-winded UNESCO convention, but I'll shorthand it here for the UNESCO Convention on Cultural Diversity. And they were given money to kind of help, see if they could help villages implement some of the directives here. And when they came back to give their presentation at this Creative Economy conferences, one of the problems that they said they found in many villages is that people didn't recognize their cultural practices as business opportunities, right? And I think that raises some really interesting questions about how the civil society groups themselves are helping to implement this idea of commodification. But interestingly, right, these groups are also on the forefront of saying that cultural exchange through arts markets is actually a form of human rights and cultural exchange. So there's a very interesting, again, tension happening here around those discourses. And I think I'm about to get the second wave. So maybe I'll just, oh, I'm done even with minutes to spare. So, but I'm going to end there, and I'll open it up for questions. I have a lot of different things to say about this, so please ask.